All right, welcome everyone to the first live Zoom events brought to you by the Heaven's Gate Study Center. I am Matt, or may know me by my YouTube handle, Varsity Bookworm. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about Heaven's Gate, and in particular, wanted to talk about the events that took place now just a little bit over 28 years ago. Which is sort of where the story kind of begins and ends for many people, as far as the story of Heaven's Gate is concerned. What I want to do here is basically kind of run through the fundamentals of Heaven's Gate, kind of their essential beliefs that they held, the kinds of practices that they engaged in, the life that they lived up to the point of their deaths, in an attempt to gain a better understanding of why they took the rather drastic, shocking step that they took. My goal, I think, is to carve this up into a few lectures. So tonight I would be focusing primarily on the Heaven's Gate in the past. Um, I know I said I gave the title as Heaven's Gate Past, Present, and Future. And actually, one of the questions I got from a couple people in the Reddit was, wait a minute, how can there be a future? And that's an excellent question. So I hope by the end of this lecture series that people will have an answer to that question. But it also made me think, one of the things I think a lot of people are surprised to find out is that there is a presence, that there are, in fact, people who continue to espouse belief in Heaven's Gate. And especially for people who are even roughly familiar with the Heaven's Gate story, sort of as it's like traditionally told, are very surprised to learn that, given that on many people's accounts, all of the Heaven's Gate members are now deceased. Now, those of us who have gotten interested in this topic for one reason or another know, of course, that that's not the case, that there are, in fact, plenty of people who were once part of the original Heaven's Gate group who are still alive and still espouse belief in these teachings. And there are also at least a few people who have what we could say recently converted to the Heaven's Gate belief system, which I think has based on kind of conversations I've had with people about the kind of research I do when I talk about that my interest is on contemporary faith in Heaven's Gate. Many people are surprised to even find out that that is a thing. Um, and so, in focusing on Heaven's Gate, the original sort of iteration of the group and their beliefs, I'm hoping that we'll also be able to learn a few things about what contemporary faith in Heaven's Gate looks like, and perhaps most importantly, how that's even possible, why that is even still tenable. So, without further ado, I'm going to kind of just jump right into it. I'm going to give myself about an hour for the presentation part. Um, and then we'll take a few minutes of a break and I'll come back and take any questions that people have at the end. I did have some questions that people posted in the Heaven's Gate subreddit, so I'll try to get to those, but I'll get to any questions that people ask in the Zoom meeting first, because you took the time to come and show up, and I really appreciate that to everyone who did. So on March 26th, 1997, the bodies of 39 men and women were discovered in a mansion in California. Their deaths were pretty quickly ruled a mass suicide. In fact, the largest to have ever occurred in the continental United States. That is still true today. Investigators later learned that these individuals had all belonged to what was, at the time, an obscure religious movement called Heaven's Gate. Of course, that's a name that most of us are more or less familiar with. But at the time, most people had really never even heard of this group before. So they didn't even really understand, like, what was going on here, who were these people. But as more information came to light concerning their religious views, much of which is because they left behind such a large body of material for people to take a look at and get an understanding of what they believed, as that information started to come to light regarding their views, it became a little bit clearer what might have happened in that California mansion and why. So, first of all, the members of this group believed that the apocalypse was imminent, and their suicides had been, at least in part, a response to that belief. They thought that their souls, or sometimes they use the term mind to refer to their souls, once separated from their bodies after death, would be collected on a spacecraft piloted by an advanced race of beings. And afterwards, once they were on board the spacecraft, their minds or souls would be implanted into new bodies, bodies that would live forever in outer space. Now, because of the extraterrestrial components of their belief system, Heaven's Gate is often cited as a UFO religion. And because of the mass suicide, many people count it among the most notorious cults in modern history. So at this point, 28 years have passed since the Heaven's Gate suicides, or the graduation, as the group members themselves referred to this event. And in that time, we have seen a host of major network documentaries, several scholarly books, and plenty of podcasts sort of converge on this topic. And while the methods, the frameworks, the theories they come up with, and even the quality of the media can vary considerably, the kinds of questions that they aim to answer seem to revolve around the following, more or less. These include the question of who were these individuals, what did they believe, how did they live, and perhaps most importantly, what ultimately was it that led to their deaths? Now, I'm going to pause here and just sort of give a little bit of background, not a whole lot, just a little bit of background in case anyone is not familiar with me or the kind of work I do or what I'm interested in as far as Heaven's Gate research goes. I've been researching the Heaven's Gate religion for about 2.5 years now. Much of my work is largely informed, I think, by having a background in philosophy, which is a little bit unusual because most of the research that gets done on Heaven's Gate and other groups that tend to be associated with Heaven's Gate comes from the religious studies kind of area of things, sociology, psychology, true crime, and anti-cults sort of activism, that sort of thing. Coming at it from like a philosophical lens, I think informs the kinds of questions that I ask, and it also informs the things that I tend to focus on. So I'm going to be focusing on sort of the internal logic to a belief system like Heaven's Gate. I might ask questions about their metaphysics, so their views pertaining to what they think reality is comprised of, their views regarding epistemology, so in other words, what they think makes something true, how they go about acquiring knowledge. That's a really interesting aspect of Heaven's Gate. And of course, there's plenty of ethical issues that sort of arise when we start thinking about the Heaven's Gate story. And so all of that is to say that my approach to this topic is, I think in some ways follows after the work of other scholars, particularly that of Benjamin Zeller, James Lewis, Robert Balch, but bringing in sort of this philosophical component. I'm bringing that up to sort of give an explanation for why I approach this topic in the way that I do and why I tend to focus on gaining an understanding of their belief system and sort of how all their different ideas kind of cohere together. And I'm particularly interested in the phenomenon of contemporary Heaven's Gate belief, as I mentioned at the beginning, which is a topic that doesn't really get as much coverage. The Heaven's Gate story is sort of bracketed off in these two moments. So the early 70s when the group was formed, and the late 90s when the movement effectively came to a conclusion. And that's sort of where the story begins and ends. And it's really interesting to think about the Heaven's Gate movement itself, in its original iteration was really only active for about 22 years. And it's now been 28 years since the mass suicide. So the span of time since the suicides is now longer than the actual iteration of the first original Heaven's Gate group. And there's quite a lot of history that has happened in the last 28 years. And I find that really interesting, and I'm hoping to try and expand on the research being done in that area. But we have to start somewhere, and I think it does make sense to start at the beginning, to sort of start with the story or with the events around which so much attention tends to converge. And in particular, because we just recently passed the 28th anniversary of the mass suicide or the exits or the graduation, to use the group's terminology. So, as far as the question of what was it that led to this decision, what was it that led to this action, if perhaps that's too strong a word, um, my hypothesis, as far as that question goes, is basically as follows. My view is that the suicides of the Heaven's Gate believers in 1997 are explainable, at least in part, in terms of their religious beliefs and in terms of their religious practices. So, in other words, I think that their actions were informed, at least in part, by what they took to be true. And I think the way that they lived their lives had, in one way or another, prepared them to take this final drastic step. And again, I want to stress that this is a hypothesis. It could be right, it could be wrong, it could be incomplete, but we have to start somewhere. The thing is that when you're doing research on a group like Heaven's Gate or any other belief system, there's always going to be a plurality of approaches that you can take to sort of tackling the subject. The kinds of questions that you ask, the way that you set about answering them, those are all of part of what comprises someone's methodology, their framework, or their approach. If you have no methodology, or if you're not aware of what your methodology is, if you don't take some space to clarify what that is, a lot of times our work ends up being incoherent. We don't really know what we're setting out to achieve, and it's not always clear to the people who read or listen to our work what exactly we're trying to do. So, uh, I happen to think that if we want to know the reasons why someone took a particular action, a good place to begin is by looking at what they believed to be true at the time they took that action and what their lives had been like up to then. So, this is the framework that I use that kind of informs the way I go about analyzing Heaven's Gate. And I like to make that clear up front so that way everyone can understand what exactly I'm doing and why. So just to reiterate, my theory again is that if we want to know why the suicides of 1997 happened, then what we'll want to do is we'll want to look at what these individuals believed and how they lived their lives. However, this theory raises an important question pretty much right at the outset. If it is true that the suicides of the Heaven's Gate believers, sometimes called the graduating class of 1997, if their deaths can in fact be explained in terms of their beliefs and their practices, then what exactly are we to make of the fact that there are still people out there today who continue to espouse belief in these same teachings of Heaven's Gate, who continue to mold their lives, at least to the best of their ability, in accordance with the teachings that the now deceased Heaven's Gate leaders first laid down? Now, the reason this question arises is because those who currently espouse belief in the teachings of Heaven's Gate have stated explicitly and on more than one occasion that they do not plan to repeat the same actions that the original followers of Heaven's Gate took in March of 1997. Yet they nevertheless maintain that they are, to the best of their ability, following the teachings of Heaven's Gate. So there seem to be two possibilities here. Either these individuals who claim that they're Heaven's Gate believers today are, I guess, lying about it. That's one possibility. Or the other possibility might be that my hypothesis, as I outlined earlier, is incorrect. Now, I think we can dispense with the first possibility pretty easily. I see no reason whatsoever why someone would lie about being a Heaven's Gate believer. I there's nothing to be gained from doing that. And also many of the people that are contemporary believers in Heaven's Gate were once themselves members of the original group, and so have been practicing these these beliefs and holding these beliefs for quite a long time. So, assuming that they're telling the truth when they claim to be Heaven's Gate believers, um, the other possibility is that my hypothesis is flawed in some way. Because if contemporary followers of Heaven's Gate believe the same things that the graduating class of 1997 believed, I don't know how else to put this, but a question that often comes up is essentially, why are they still here? Why didn't they quote unquote leave in the same way that these previous members did? So one possibility is that something else must be at play here in terms of explaining the suicides of 1997, something other than their beliefs, as I've said. Something must be true of them that isn't true of believers today. Well, my hope is by the end of, if not this talk, by the end of this lecture series, it will be clear why I still stand by my hypothesis that the deaths of the members in 1997 are explainable in terms of their beliefs and practices, and that this is not in any way contradictory to the fact that there are still believers in Heaven's Gate today. What I'm hoping to try and make clear, in other words, is why it is the case that we can explain the suicides of 1997 in terms of what the group believed, just as we can explain the phenomenon of contemporary belief in Heaven's Gate in terms of the very same teachings. Now, I understand this will probably sound very counterintuitive, which is precisely why this topic interests me so much, because it is a challenge. It is simply not obvious to everyone, even to those who are roughly familiar with the Heaven's Gate story as it's sort of traditionally been told, why someone would, first of all, want to believe in Heaven's Gate today, like what would be attractive to someone today about this set of teachings, especially given how the movement ended, which is to say nothing of whether or not it is even like possible, whether it's even actually tenable for someone to currently believe in Heaven's Gate in any meaningful sense of the word. So, what I intend to show here is that, however striking as it might seem, the notion of contemporary belief in Heaven's Gate is perfectly consistent with the same belief system that led so many others in the past to their deaths. So, I think it's safe to say that I've got my work cut out for me, and I hope that what I have to say here today will, at the very least, give you some things to think about. All right, so at the outset, I said we're going to want to know what these individuals believed. So let's start there. And the first thing I would say about the Heaven's Gate belief system is that it is really a lot more complex than many might suspect. I think their practices that they lived by were much richer than many give them credit. And the fact that their religion developed and sort of evolved over time is something that I think a lot of people fail to really appreciate. In terms of their belief system, which, as I've already said, is somewhat complicated, we'll need to make some decisions about what we want to focus on. And with that in mind, there are a few specific things that we'll want to be looking for in their belief system. So first of all, we'll want to know what they believed as far as how the universe is structured, what kinds of things exist, how the world we live in came to be in the first place, and for what purpose. Beliefs of this kind we can call cosmological, the study of the cosmos. On the flip side, opposite their views about like the world's creation, how it all came into existence in the first place, we'll also want to know what they thought about the way the world would come to an end, their eschatology, or the study of the end times. And finally, just as we will want to know what they believed concerning the origin, purpose, and fate of the world, we'll also want to know what they believed concerning the origin, purpose, and fate of the world's inhabitants, namely human beings. Why have we been brought into existence in the first place? What happens to us after we die? And how can we ensure that our fate in the afterlife, whatever that is, how can we make sure that our fate will be a good one? So beliefs of this kind we can group under the heading of soteriology, which is the study of salvation or the salvation doctrine. So we've got cosmology, eschatology, and soteriology, and these are what I like to call kind of three basic ingredients of virtually any religion. Every religion will have, most religions, if not all, will have something that they'll populate each of these types of belief sets with, various information that would be unique to that religious system. And so for that reason, I think it's a good way to sort of make an entry point into understanding the broader structure of the Heaven's Gate religion. So let's start at the beginning, meaning the beginning of everything, beginning of the world, the cosmology of Heaven's Gate. So, in terms of the origin and purpose of the planet and the origin and purpose of our species, Heaven's Gate believed that the world was created and maintained by an advanced race of extraterrestrials. These were known as next level members. The reason they were called next level members is because they were thought to be the next level, the next evolutionary level beyond that of the human species. So we can think about it in terms of like humans might be the next level beyond non-human animals, and then the next level beings are the ones beyond humans. They live in the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven or simply the next level. This is a physical place somewhere out in the universe. It is not in another dimension, not exactly. That's kind of I think, an unusual aspect of Heaven's Gate, and I've talked about this in my podcast, In Search of Heaven's Gate, that I released a couple of years ago, almost a couple of years ago at this point, where Heaven's Gate is sort of a like kind of a monistic religion. Like everything sort of takes place on this one plane of existence. There isn't this sort of like spiritual other dimension where things are going on. Like when we go to heaven, we're actually going to a physical location that just happens to be very far away. So far away that you actually need a spaceship to get there. Now, as far as how these entities came into existence, as far as why they chose to create our planet or our species in the first place, this is something I could be mistaken on, but at this point in my research, what I've come to understand is that these kinds of questions are ones that Heaven's Gate believers tend to be more or less agnostic on. And that's something that I actually think is really interesting about Heaven's Gate is that there's sort of a certain bar for what kinds of information they actually consider really important. Like, for example, they might have speculated what a next level member might look like. And in fact, if you've seen any of the documentaries about Heaven's Gate, you've probably seen the picture of this alien creature who's supposed to represent one of the members of this higher kingdom. But they weren't like married to this particular conception. Like they were totally open to the possibility that like we might get up on the spaceship and find out that these creatures look nothing like this painting. This is just sort of our best guess at what they might look like. And for one reason or another, beliefs like that were not super important to them to have like some definite answer. And that's kind of one of the things that I think is kind of a defining feature of Heaven's Gate. It's one of the things that makes it so interesting is that it's a fairly adaptable belief system. There's sort of this tendency to kind of assume like, well, surely you must know all of the information, but the way that the religion kind of worked was like, no, we're sort of getting this information from the next level, and it's being translated into a human mind, which is full of all sorts of problems, and we can think of it like being kind of having a bad reception sort of thing. So there's always the possibility that the information they were getting might need to be revised later. Very, very important aspect of Heaven's Gate is the concept of revising or updating information, and we'll see that as we move forward. So as far as how they understood the world, like what they thought the world actually was, they talked about the planet Earth as being kind of like a garden or an experiment. And in fact, they sometimes would synthesize those two ideas together by calling it a garden experiment. So you've got the idea of it being a garden, the other idea of it being sort of like a laboratory where things are being tested out, the garden experiment. They used a lot of agricultural sort of terminology and analogies to talk about their beliefs. That's pretty common. So much like a field of crops would have a gardener, someone that created it, somebody that maintains it, they believed that the crops, in this case human beings, would begin at a certain stage of development, they would grow, and eventually they would be harvested, or at least the ones deemed worthy of being harvested. So they believed that periodically, just as a field of crops would need to be replanted, resoiled, spaded under, recycled. These are kind of the terms that Heaven's Gate would use. They thought the same thing was true of the earth. These next level beings created this laboratory or this garden for one purpose or another, and eventually their experiment will come to an end. Eventually, the season will come to an end, and it'll come time to harvest whatever they grew. And so essentially, we're taking this sort of garden agricultural terminology and applying it to the planet Earth. But it's not like the idea of the Earth being recycled is not just metaphorical. Like it is something they literally think is going to happen, or actually, I guess I should say they think it's something that has already begun. We'll want to come back to that. Now, among other things, they also believed that the world is populated by both good and evil forces. They thought that members of the next level would intervene in human affairs in a way that would positively influence human development, particularly spiritual development, while members of another sort of fallen race of aliens called the lower forces or the Luciferians, these evil forces would intervene in human affairs in a way to impede growth, to cause problems for our spiritual development. So, members of the next level endeavor to help us grow, and members of the lower forces or the Luciferians endeavor to hold us back in our development. So, some examples of the next level intervening in human affairs might have included, say, someone coming to a meeting held by Heaven's Gate and feeling attracted to their message. It might have included someone overcoming an addiction that they've been wrestling with for some time, or overcoming some harmful behavior or unhelpful mindset that they had previously struggled to change. On the other hand, examples of lower forces intervening in human affairs might have included things like negative thoughts, temptations, conflicts, chaos, that sort of thing. So, just as almost any other religion, Heaven's Gate offers an explanation for some of the biggest questions that people have posed since pretty much the beginning of human history. How did our world come to exist? Why do we observe certain phenomena out in the world? How can we account for the various paths that different people follow in their lives? It also gives an account of our world's origin, structure, and its relation to the rest of the universe. And it even hints at a possible purpose or plan behind the world's existence. Namely, in this case, that the world we live in is part of a grand experiment conducted by a compassionate, intelligent race of beings from beyond our immediate perception. And it also gives an account of our behavior. Why do we do the things we do? Why do we struggle to change? But it also hints at a possible solution, namely, in this case, modeling our own behavior after that of our more advanced creators to whatever extent we can, which would become a big factor in life in Heaven's Gate. I think we can see at this point certain underlying assumptions that must be in place here, that I think are important to highlight. Because I think the way that someone understands the world, the way they think about the world, is going to be naturally bound up with what kinds of things they think exist. So we might ask in that case, which one comes first? Like when a religion is forming, do people look out and observe certain things happening, observe certain things in existence, and then look for an explanation? Or is it the other way around? Like, do people accept a certain explanation or certain theory of things first, like prima facie, and then deduce from that that certain things existing or certain things being the case must follow? Well, when it comes to Heaven's Gate, I think it's what's really interesting is we can actually see evidence of both. We can see both sides of this sort of equation. Um, Specifically, I happen to think that the framers of Heaven's Gate, the people that came up with Heaven's Gate, took certain things as more or less a given. And the most obvious of these would be the existence of extraterrestrials. And what I mean is that they took it as a given that intelligent life exists beyond our planet, and they took it as a given that these life forms are not just aware of our existence, but are actually interested in us, that they interact with our world and our species in one capacity or another. So when it comes to extraterrestrials, the question for Heaven's Gate was not, do these entities exist, but rather, who are these beings? Like we know they're out there. Who are they? And what is the nature of their interest in our world and our species? And I think this is borne out in the some of the earliest flyers that Heaven's Gate put up in the mid 70s, where they promised to answer the following questions. Who are they? What are UFOs? Why have they come here? That sort of thing. Like it wasn't about proving that extraterrestrials existed. It was about clarifying their nature and clarifying our relationship to them. So while Heaven's Gate is most often called a UFO religion, and not without good reason, we tend to run the risk of leaving out another crucial element of their belief system. Perhaps one could even argue a much more important aspect, and that is the extent to which Heaven's Gate derived their thinking from Christianity. In fact, Heaven's Gate considered their religion not to be really this new movement at all, but rather they considered it to be an update to the teachings of Christ. Which brings me to the second thing that I think the framers of Heaven's Gate sort of took as a given, and that would be certain aspects of Christian doctrine. In other words, they took it as a given that Christian cosmology, eschatology, and soteriology were, broadly speaking, correct. And so, with respect to this element of the Heaven's Gate religion, the question wasn't so much, are the Gospels true? Is Genesis true? Is Revelation true? But rather, what is the proper way to interpret these texts? And I think this is borne out in the fact that, again, Heaven's Gate described their mission as an update to the Christian teachings, the teachings of Christ. And that much of their work, in fact, consisted in reinterpreting and recontextualizing, or from their perspective, correcting under popular understandings of Christian doctrine. So they weren't in the business of like proving that Christ existed or that he rose from the dead or that God created the worlds or that there was a fall of man or anything. They weren't in the business of proving that these things happened. It was more about identifying the essential points of Christian teaching that they thought needed to be emphasized and then updating Christianity with what they proposed was new information that they had received. So I mentioned that they took certain things as givens, the existence of extraterrestrials, and they took certain aspects of Christian doctrine as a given. Now, what certain aspects are we talking about? And what exactly about extraterrestrials did they take as a given? I think these two things should be unpacked at least a little bit. Because the thing is, when it comes to belief in extraterrestrials, there are lots of different paths you can kind of go down. You might think that ETs exist, but they don't know that we exist. You could think that extraterrestrials exist. They are aware that we're in existence as well, and they want to do bad things to us. They want to take over our planets. They want to kidnap us and perform experiments and something else along those lines. Or you might think extraterrestrials exist, they're aware of us, and they want to help. They might want to teach us a better way to live. Maybe they want to save our planet from destruction by our own hands, whether like environmental damage that we're doing or nuclear war or something like that. Or maybe they want to save our planet from like an asteroid or perhaps another invasive alien species, like an evil alien species. Um, so there's a lot of different possibilities in terms of just mere secular extraterrestrial belief. And I have talked about this in more detail in a lecture I gave um, almost a couple of years ago, um, called "What Are UFO Religions?" where I kind of talk about like the distinction between like the jump that you make from just believing that extraterrestrials exist to actually endorsing a UFO religion. Like, at what point does that belief become religious? So there's a lot of things that can be true of someone that believes in extraterrestrials that doesn't qualify as necessarily religious belief. So the question then becomes, what what was that jump that Heaven's Gate made? What view of extraterrestrials did they actually espouse? Well, I think we should consider at least one of the other paths that someone could take with ET belief, which is that um, perhaps the reason extraterrestrials know we exist is quite simply because they had something to do with it. They had something to do with us being here in the first place. Maybe they created us. Maybe they created the whole planet or the whole universe. And if that's the case, maybe they have a plan for us. And so I think that much like many other UFO religions, Heaven's Gate conceptualized their extraterrestrials as being more emotionally, more mentally, and more physiologically advanced than human beings. They understood these entities to be highly efficient at performing very complex tasks, not very prone to emotional outbursts the way that humans tend to be at times. They're genderless, they're hairless, basically sort of this ideal version of a human being. And the reason I mentioned the hairless part, because that seems like kind of arbitrary. Why would I throw that in there? Um, I remember when I was looking into like UFO religions and stuff. I remembered reading years ago that there's some like evolutionary biologists who think that over time we may actually continue to lose more and more hair as we continue to evolve. And so I wonder if that has something to do with why so many UFO religions conceptualize extraterrestrials as being hairless, because I think maybe that's a way of saying that these are sort of further down the line, evolutionarily speaking, in comparison to humans. And so, in terms of clarifying our relationship to these beings, our relationship is very much that of a creation. We're the creation, and they are the creators. And lucky for us, they are conceptualized as benevolent and compassionate and highly capable in various ways. So that's always good, right? If you're going to be created by an alien species, you would hope that they would at least be, nice about it. Now, as far as the essentials of Christianity that I talked about earlier, from Heaven's Gate's perspective, there are at least a few main reasons why someone would want to start a new religion based on Christianity. And of course, most new religious movements don't think of themselves as new religions, but we'll set that aside for the time being. Sorry, we had somebody come in the waiting room, so I just wanted to let them in real quick. So one reason someone might want to start a quote unquote new religion, particularly one founded more or less on Christianity, would be that they disagree with one doctrine or another. They have a different view of, I don't know, the Trinity or salvation or, you know, how God actually intervenes in terms of, grace and stuff like that. There might be some sort of major doctrinal disagreements that would lead to a schism and the offshoot of a new Christian sect. The other possibility is that someone might disagree with what, on their view, has been either overemphasized or underemphasized. And I think that when it comes to Heaven's Gate, the latter motivation really comes to the fore, because there's really, this might sound surprising, but aside from the alien stuff, there really isn't a whole lot that they're adding that is new per se to their understanding of Christian doctrine. But they are clearly approaching it through a particular lens. So it's not so much about adding new stuff, but reinterpreting, recontextualizing things in a fairly radical light. For Heaven's Gate, there are certain specific aspects of Christ's teachings that they think have been sort of watered down over time. That they believed that in order to follow Christ, in order to really truly believe in Christ, you needed to do what Christ did. Well, what did Christ do? Well, that's what I'm talking about in terms of like disagreements over emphasizing, like what should we be emphasizing? Because Christ did quite a lot of things. I mean, he was hanging around for like 3.5 years or so. There were a lot of different things that he did according to the Gospels before his death and resurrection, according to the way the story goes. Um, in terms of which things we ought to emphasize, which things we ought to focus on, in terms of what we're actually referring to when we say you have to do what Christ did in order to really follow him. Well, what did he do? It's going to depend on who you ask. If you ask Heaven's Gate, what Christ did was he overcame his humanness. He laid down his life and returned to this higher kingdom from which he originally came. So again, it isn't so much about adding new elements to Christianity as much as it is attempting to bring certain elements that are already there in Christianity more or less to the fore. Now, this is important to understand because I think a lot of Heaven's Gate involves this sort of interpretation process. They begin not just with things that they take as a given, like the existence of ETs and broadly speaking, the truth of Christ's teachings, but they also have issues with like it being watered down over time. They have issues with people thinking that just living a good life is sufficient to entering the kingdom of heaven. That's one of the things that Applewhite would really drive home in a lot of his videos is basically if you think that you're going to get into heaven by being a good person, you are sadly mistaken. The demands are much, much higher. They believed that you really had to do what Christ did. You had to be willing to give up everything. And so when people ask, how could someone find Heaven's Gate appealing today? Well, I think this could be at least one reason why. There are still people who believe in extraterrestrials. In fact, I guess there's probably more people that believe in it now than ever before. I don't quote me on that there because there are statistics on this sort of thing. So don't I could be wrong about that, but it's fairly high the prevalence of extraterrestrial belief amongst people. And there's also people that uh, find something of value in Christian doctrine, but for one reason or another, they have some sort of issue with, maybe they have issues with what they would, might interpret as intolerance, issues in terms of maybe hypocrisy. Maybe people might have been jaded by Christianity, but there's something that still pulls them towards that. I think that was very much the case when Heaven's Gate first got started, and I think that could very well still be the case today. But I'll come back to that in the, in a uh, probably the next lecture. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Now, I know we've already spent a lot of time on the cosmological views of Heaven's Gate, and as I indicated earlier, there are three sets of views that we want to focus on. Thankfully, we don't really need to spend too much time on the eschatology, the end times doctrine, since, as I think we've already seen, the cosmological and eschatological views of this belief system are very closely bound up, which I think is fairly common in religion, right? It makes sense that the end of the world will, in some sense or another, kind of function as the mirror to the world's creation. Whoever made the world is probably going to be the one to bring it to an end. Whatever problems were in place kind of from the outset will come to a close. Um, Everything will be sort of made right. Everything will be kind of put back in order. And in these respects, the Heaven's Gate conception of the end times is, I think, not too dissimilar from that of other religions in terms of, you have sort of a beginning, middle, and end to the story. In at least a couple other aspects, though, it is somewhat unconventional. For one thing, Heaven's Gate conceptualized the apocalypse not as some singular cataclysmic event, but rather as a process that would take some time to actually complete. In fact, they even speculated that it could take centuries. Perhaps most strikingly, however, They believed it might not even be apparent to the people left behind that it's actually happening. In other words, the world might be ending and we might not even recognize that. But one of the reasons I bring this up is because a lot of people um, will say, well, the end of the world never happened. So obviously Heaven's Gate was wrong. Well, that might be true, but it's unfalsifiable. If it is in fact the case that, first of all, the end of the world could actually take some time to complete, and on the other hand, we might not even be aware that it's actually happening. So a lot of people, put another way, think that the evidence against Heaven's Gate being right is borne out in the fact that, well, we're still here, the world hasn't ended. Well, whether you believe that or not, it's not a defeater for the Heaven's Gate belief system because in the first place, it's possible from their perspective that the end of the world or the recycling or the spading under, as they call it, it's possible that that has already begun, just as they predicted it would, and we're simply not aware of it. And it's possible that it has only just begun. In other words, they seem to think that it could last a long time. I think in one video, Applewhite speculates that it could last up to 1,000 years. He says he's really not sure. Actually, the reason he gives is because he's not in charge of that task. He says basically, I'm not in charge of recycling the earth, so I don't really need to know that kind of information. So I find that really, really fascinating that there's sort of this kind of chain of commands. That is actually a term that they themselves would use, that there is a chain of commands in terms of what kind of information each person gets. And that was even true for the leaders of Heaven's Gate. There were certain things that they, from their perspective, felt like well, we must not need to know that. If we don't know it, if the next level hasn't given us that information, well, then it must not be important for us to know. Very pragmatic group of people in many ways. So one of the things that makes this kind of important to understand is that there is sort of an epistemic problem that comes along with Heaven's Gate's conception of the end of the world, which is to say, a problem that pertains to what we can know about the state of things, about the world, about ourselves. Namely this, the world may be ending as we speak, and we might not even know it. That's very that's very wild to think about. And we may also observe that Heaven's Gate has, in some way, sort of set things up so that their end times prediction can really never be disproven. Now, we may rightly observe that that is somewhat suspiciously convenient, but I think more importantly, the thing to take away from that is it may end up serving as a partial answer to a question I proposed at the beginning. Namely, how could someone possibly believe in Heaven's Gate, given that their end times prediction appears to have already been disproven? Right? But we explained why that's not why the fact that the world still exists is not a defeater for that. But again, nevertheless, people will still maintain that, okay, well, it's still not true, right? Most people are still not convinced. But what's so interesting about this is, at least the way I understand it, is Heaven's Gate's eschatology is precisely one of the reasons why belief in Heaven's Gate is still possible today, why it is still at a minimum tenable for someone to hold. It's because, according to the Heaven's Gate religion, the world does not just end with a bang, as it were. It is a process that would take place over some length of time, and it may not even be perceptible to those who have not been given, as it were, the eyes to see or the ears to hear. Their end times doctrine does not, on my analysis at least, present really any major problem for contemporary Heaven's Gate belief. I actually think it helps to substantiate contemporary faith in Heaven's Gate. Now, that might be somewhat controversial, but I think it's at least interesting to think about. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago that only those with a capacity to understand things as they really are from Heaven's Gate's perspective, would be able to recognize the end times as such, right? That would be able to recognize, okay, the world is ending. This is what's really going on. And I also mentioned in the previous section that a lot of Heaven's Gate involves correcting what, in their view, are mistakes in terms of how people are interpreting various Christian teachings and various religious concepts like creation, God, the afterlife, heaven, and so on. Well, as it turns out, this notion of exclusive access to the facts, whether facts about the world's creation, facts about the world's ends, facts about our nature, our purpose, our destiny in the afterlife. Um, this notion of exclusive access to the facts, in other words, knowledge that only some people possess, is a recurring theme in the Heaven's Gate belief system. In fact, the first step in their salvation process is precisely this: being given the capacity to recognize things as they really are. In another word, we could call it grace, a gift given to certain people by the next level. And at this point, we can go into the third and final component of the Heaven's Gate belief system that I think is uh, worth unpacking, which is their soteriology or salvation doctrine. Now, in plenty of senses, the way that Heaven's Gate conceptualized salvation follows, I think, very naturally from the other components of their belief system that we've already discussed: the origin and purpose of the planet, the origin and purpose of our species, and the eventual destruction of the planet. So, in other words, it follows naturally from their cosmology and their eschatology. In another sense, however, their salvation process is, I think, one of the most complex components of their belief system, because it is something that, in at least one factor, evolved over time. And for the sake of space, I will be focusing primarily on their soteriology as they would have understood it in 1997. I would just note that there had been some other versions of this theory, including versions which explicitly precluded the idea that the followers themselves would have to die, going back all the way to the earliest days of the movement, in fact. And I've gone over how their understanding of salvation kind of developed and refined over the years in the last episode of the In Search of Heaven's Gate podcast called Going Beyond Human. So if you're interested in seeing that in a little bit more detail, you can check that out. But for our purposes, I'll be working off the last iteration of their soteriology, which more or less goes something like this. And I kind of carve it up into 4 stages. Not unlike the end of the world, which they describe as a process, salvation perhaps makes the most sense to describe as a process and as something that occurs over time as well. The first of these is what I would call grace. And we can think of grace as being somewhat similar to the notion of grace in Christianity. It's a gift given by God. It is, if not salvation itself, some sort of necessary prerequisite for salvation, or for salvation to even be possible. So consider this quote from, I believe this is from Doe's Final Exit, where Applewhite says, "We are aware that if you have not been given an ingredient of knowledge, of information by that kingdom, then you certainly will have no capacity to know that I am telling you the truth, or that this information has any validity." So again, there's that recurring theme of sort of exclusive access. Only some people will be able to recognize this truth as being true. Other people won't get it. They won't understand. So that capacity to recognize things as they really are is itself a gift that has to come from the next level. So some of the terminology that they used to refer to this gift they receive by grace from the next level would be the mind, or the soul, or the spirit. They might also use the term deposit, as in the idea of having certain information deposited into your mind. They referred to it as a gift quite often. And one of the things that it enabled someone to do was it enabled them to recognize Applewhite and Nettles, or T and Doe, as being precisely who they claims they were, which is to say, people who had come from heaven to save people from the end of the world. And it also meant that someone had the potential to grow and develop spiritually. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this grace could be rejected, someone could refuse it, or it could be forfeited or lost along the way, at least as far as I understand it. I think this concept is very complicated, not just with Heaven's Gate, but with any religion that has this sort of idea, because we get into questions of like free will and predestination and all that other fun stuff. So I won't go too deep down the rabbit hole there. I would just say that this is a very complex but endlessly interesting aspect of Heaven's Gate. My, I will just throw it out there. My working hypothesis, as far as how they understand the whole grace free will thing, it seems to me that this idea that you have to have this uh, deposit of information given to you by the next level. There's no way that you can get this deposit yourself. Like you can't find it somewhere. You can't get it from someone else. You have to get it from the next level. They have to select you. Um, so they have to kind of be, they have to take the first step. So as far as I'm concerned, that kind of removes free will in the sense that most people would probably use the term. It leaves open the possibility for like a compatibilist view of free will, but I won't go into that too much. If I had to throw something out there, I would say that when it comes to the free will thing and the salvation doctrine thing, if we wanted to uh, bring some sort of connection back to Christianity, well, two big schools of thought would be Calvinism and Arminianism, two competing schools of thought about how salvation actually works. Heaven's Gate seems to be closer to Arminianism than Calvinism because Arminians, unlike Calvinists, believe that grace can be lost. In other words, you can be saved, but then you can screw it up somewhere along the way and lose your salvation. You can always get it back, but you can lose it. Calvinists, as far as I understand from what I remember, do not believe that that is possible. So it seems like Heaven's Gate is closer to the Arminians than the Calvinists. Just food for thought there. Always open to other, criticisms and pushback and other theories in terms of this stuff. Like, I think about all these things, but what I would really like to see is more people, kind of coming up with like their own takes on these things. Like I'm not trying to put out like the end all be all theory of Heaven's Gate or anything. Far from it. It's more about just sort of keeping this conversation going and including other, perspectives in the discussion. So after you get grace, after you get selected by the next level, the next step is you need to find and follow a teacher. This is extremely important to understand, and I think one of the most important things that people should know when it comes to Heaven's Gate is that if you cannot find a living teacher, or what they call a representative, someone who can guide you off of this planet, you cannot reach the next level. You can learn all the things, all the trivia about Heaven's Gate you want. You can do all the, do your best to follow the teachings as best you can. But if you cannot find a living, incarnated member from the next level who is living on Earth in human form to actually guide you off the planet, they don't believe it's possible to get into the next level. So this is a really unusual aspect, I think, of Heaven's Gate is that salvation is sort of it's only offered periodically. It's only offered every well, there's some discrepancies in terms of how many thousands of years they seem to think. I've seen it anywhere from 6,000 to 2,000, but quite a long stretch of time passes from each opportunity to get off of this planet and enter the next level. And in the interim, um, at least certain people would just simply reincarnate from one life to the next. But we'll come back to that. I probably just threw like a lot of stuff out there. I hope I'm not overwhelming people with information. And I am coming to the close of what I want to cover in this talk. So appreciate you sticking it out with me so far. So this second stage, what I call faith, is something that needs to be nurtured. It consists of, really accepting what Tiendo said as true. It meant applying the things that they were trying to teach you to do. Um, one of the things that Sawyer told me when I met him was he described it as using Tiendo's minds when you were thinking through a problem or trying to, you know, figure out what to do, that you were supposed to be relying on their minds. You were supposed to be using the terminology that they used to refer to various things. You were supposed to be using the schema that they sort of developed for interpreting reality, and ultimately the practices that they prescribed for handling various challenges and various problems that you might face in life. But perhaps the most important part of this, again, is being able to recognize your representative as such. So someone goes to a Heaven's Gate meeting back in the 70s or in the early 90s, the second time that they went out on the road. They go to a meeting, but they're listening to T and Do talk or listening to just Do talk, depending on what it was. And they're like, this stuff is crazy. I don't buy any of this. Um, Clearly, that person does not have a deposit of information, or perhaps they just don't have enough information to recognize these teachers as who they were. Somebody goes to a Heaven's Gate meeting and they click right away and they think, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for, and I didn't even know it until I found it. Everything sort of makes sense now. Clearly, that person has some amount of information that they've been given from the next level. They have some capacity to recognize that T and Do are who they say they are, and that what they're saying is true. Now, what's interesting with Heaven's Gate is the person who goes to the meeting and is like, this is nuts. I don't buy this. They might have actually been given a deposit of information at that meeting that, perhaps in some future incarnation, some future life they might have, that person might have some sort of stored up memory of that event that could then be sort of nurtured, that could, they could build off of that experience in the future. In fact, a lot of the people that were part of the graduating class of 97 believed that they had previously been incarnated in the time of Christ, and that they actually knew Jesus and heard him talk and teach, but that they, for one reason or another, either didn't fully accept what Jesus was saying, or they partially accepted it, but they weren't willing to go all the way. They weren't really ready to fully commit. But the idea with Heaven's Gate and the way they understand reincarnation, not too dissimilar from the way it's talked about in like the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, is this idea that the experiences you have in each life, you build on those as time goes on. I guess this is also sort of similar to like Socrates' understanding of reincarnation too. Um, but yeah, there's this idea that like the information that you pick up from these sorts of experiences may very well be something that could be built upon later in future incarnations. And this is kind of important to keep in mind because it explains again why someone might feel like why might someone uh, continue to espouse belief in Heaven's Gate today, even though, as far as it seems, like all of the the original members, most of them at least, died in 97. And if it's true, as we said, that the only way to enter the next level is if there's a living representative, well, you might wonder, well, why the heck would someone want to follow this teaching today? Well, this is kind of where the idea of reincarnation would sort of come in. The next step in the salvation process would be what they call overcoming. So, the idea of overcoming your human ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving was paramount in life in Heaven's Gate. It's sort of the main project that you're supposed to be working on from day to day. Uh, what are we overcoming? Well, everything, right? Because at one point in their history, they actually referred to themselves as Total Overcomers Anonymous because they liked the idea of like like Narcotics Anonymous, and Sexaholics Anonymous, and sort of all these anonymous groups that were like giving up something that they were addicted to. But Heaven's Gate was like, well, we're addicted to everything and we're trying to overcome all of it. So we're the total overcomers anonymous. We're overcoming the whole package, the whole human deal. That means no sex, no smoking, no drug use, no drinking. Material possessions are kept to a very bare minimum. Um, Even giving up one's previous social identity down to the very name that they use to identify themselves. This was all part of the overcoming process, as they called it. One of the lines from there's a document called the 1995 Statement by an ET Presently Incarnate. I mean, what a title. That's just a phenomenal title for any piece of text. There's a really like kind of provocative quote from that document where they say that a potential creature of the next level cannot cling to human ways any more than a butterfly can cling to caterpillar ways. So this metaphor of the caterpillar and the cocoon or the chrysalis, this was a very early a metaphor that they used very early on in the group's history, and every once in a while they seems to pull it out here and there. But really, the idea was that a caterpillar, in order to become a butterfly, has to completely give up being a caterpillar. It can't sort of hold on and be like, oh, but I still want to kind of hold on to my caterpillar identity. And it's like, no, you've got to be 100% committed to becoming a butterfly. It's the way they looked at their spiritual developments, going from being human to being next level. Which brings me to the fourth and final stage of the salvation process, what we could call graduation. Um, this is really where sort of the things get a little bit complicated, because this is the stage of their salvation process that appears to have undergone some revision over the years, whereas the other three stages, they were more or less intact throughout the group's tenure. But the specific method by which they planned to leave the planet, that is something that sort of changed over time. They always wanted to leave. They always planned on leaving. They always thought that the world was going to end and we're going to have to get off of here somehow, some way. But the exact method that they thought that would happen is something that needed to be revised at various points throughout the history. And I won't go into that in too much detail here because I know I've already been talking for quite a while, a little bit longer than I had originally planned. And also, again, this specific aspect of Heaven's Gate's history, sort of the development of their belief system, and in particular, the development of the concept of graduation, how they planned to actually leave the planet. Remember, they did not originally plan to die. They did not originally think that they would need to end their lives by their own hands. That was something that became introduced later down the road. Um, but that whole process, again, very, very interesting, but somewhat complicated. And I go into that in more detail in the last episode of In Search of Heaven's Gate. That's really focuses on that aspect of their history. One thing I will say though is that Heaven's Gate believers themselves, I've heard say, well, there never was a change. There was no change to their belief system. This is actually maybe one of the most controversial points in terms of like one of the most contentious points, I should say, between Heaven's Gate believers and the people who research Heaven's Gate from a, secular uh, academic perspective, is that there is sort of this kind of prevailing narrative that at some point in the group's history, their ideas shifted from we're not going to have to die. Like we're going to be picked up by a UFO and we're going to go up in our bodies. Maybe we'll get new bodies once we get there, that sort of thing, to, oh, actually, we have to give up our human bodies here. Our souls actually have to leave and go on the spaceship. Quite a drastic change there. Now, some Heaven's Gate believers I've heard say, well, no, there really wasn't actually a change. They were always consistent. And in fact, they were always consistent on the concept of leaving the planet. Um, some people on sort of more the academic side, though, really tend to focus on Bonnie Nettles' death in 1985. They tend to say, like, well, they must have been like so freaked out or so depressed or just like so confounded by the fact that one of their group's leaders passed away from natural causes that they kind of just went off the rails and became like really kind of their beliefs took a darker turn. That's one way that narrative sort of gets forwarded. I I've talked about my thoughts on that hypothesis in other places, so I won't go into that too much here. I would say that I fall somewhere in the middle, because on the one hand, the Heaven's Gate believers do have they have sort of a point when they say that there wasn't a change, because originally the way that it worked was Applewhite and Nettles or T and Doe were going to be martyred in public. And then 3 days later, they were going to rise from the dead and they were going to fly away in a spacecraft with all of their followers. So the followers wouldn't have to die, just Applewhite and Nettles, and they wouldn't die for very long. They would resurrect, as you do after a few days or so. But everyone would go up in their bodies in the spacecraft, and they called this the demonstration. Now, some Heaven's Gate believers I've talked to have said, like, well, in a way, the demonstration kind of happened exactly as they predicted. Maybe they weren't literally martyred, maybe they weren't literally assassinated, but their image and their memory was given sort of a media assassination treatment. Now, how far you want to take that metaphor, that's totally up to you. I'm just throwing that out there that that's one way I've seen some Heaven's Gate believers today sort of reconcile this apparent shift in thinking. Now, like I said earlier, I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. I definitely am. I mean, and this could change at some point. I'm always open to having my mind changed, but I am not particularly convinced that Bonnie Nettles' death had as much to do with their eventual suicides as some people seem to think. It might have been a factor, but I do not think it was like the difference maker. I'm not convinced that if it didn't happen, we can be sure that they wouldn't have committed suicide. I'm just not comfortable going making an assertion that strong because I just don't see enough evidence to support that. But I don't want to dwell too much on that because, like I said, it's very controversial. And this is the one that I mean, the things that I say about this topic in particular, these are the views that get me in trouble with everyone. These are the views that get me in trouble with Heaven's Gate believers, and it's also the things that get me in trouble with people that are super critical of Heaven's Gate. Because it's almost like if you go too far in questioning or challenging the narrative that believers themselves have sort of embraced, there is always a risk of kind of I've seen it happen. I mean, I've had one of them has been has recently written a blog kind of taking me to task for some things I said a few weeks ago, and I actually love that. I actually love that we have people today who believe in this religion and participate in this conversation. I would actually like to see more researchers include Heaven's Gate believers at the table when they're doing their work and, respond to their criticisms, of which there are many, believe me. But it's also interesting to see that people that are really critical of Heaven's Gate, people that are, really not super interested in the history and maybe sort of the academic kind of philosophical analysis that I'm more interested in personally. Um, there's almost sort of like this quota that you have to fill to not piss those people off, which is you have to make sure that you talk about how crazy Heaven's Gate was. You have to make sure you talk about how dangerous they were. And if you don't do that, or you don't do that to their liking, they accuse you of basically being a cult apologist. They accuse you of whitewashing them or watering it down. And I don't know. I've just kind of gotten to a point where I've accepted like you're never going to be able to please everybody. But as long as you're making the strongest case you can for the positions you hold, um, that's the most you can do. And quite frankly, I think that's what Heaven's Gate believers are doing. The beliefs that they have, from my perspective, are not arbitrary. They are there is a remarkable degree of internal consistency to their belief system that is, I think, very surprising and quite underappreciated by people in the public. And that's something that I hope my work helps to sort of highlight and more, bring to the fore, is just how rich and complex this belief system actually is, whether we agree with it or not. Yeah, it looks like I talked a little bit longer than I was planning to. So, and I really, really appreciate people coming in and hanging out with me while I go through this. One of the reasons I wanted to do this live is actually largely because I need to be held accountable. You know, one of the things that I personally need to overcome or work on is I am a perfectionist sometimes. Sometimes I'm the exact opposite of a perfectionist. But one of the things that I sort of need to work on or overcome in Heaven's Gate terminology is I will spend a lot of time writing stuff, and then I'll get distracted by some other rabbit hole I want to go down, and I'll have a bunch of stuff written that I don't share with anyone. And one of the things that I found helpful is sort of saying, all right, dude, you've got 3 days to put something together because you're going to do it live in front of people. So figure it out. So sometimes I need to kind of put guardrails, for myself to kind of follow, um, to, put stuff out. Yeah, self-asserted deadline. Um, so the last thing I will end on, and then I'll open it up for questions or discussion, whatever you guys want to do. What I would say, there are two recurring themes that I've tried to highlight in the Heaven's Gate religion, which are, on the one hand, this notion of what we could call proper understanding, and then this notion of special access, this notion of exclusive access to the facts. Um, in a sense, I kind of agree with Heaven's Gate that there are more or less accurate ways of interpreting things, right? There are more or less ways of interpreting stuff that's going on. Um, I guess you could even say that much of my work and much of the work of other Heaven's Gate researchers is kind of predicated on that view, right? The way that someone goes about looking at Heaven's Gate, the way they go about analyzing it, is going to lead you to certain conclusions that you're going to think are more correct, right? Otherwise, why would you put them forward? Or at the very least, you think they are supported by some reliable evidence. As far as this whole idea of exclusive access to knowledge, that is certainly at least one point where I think me and Heaven's Gate kind of part ways. And it's, in fact, where I part ways with lots of other belief systems. I have a sort of natural aversion to any idea of, well, this is only some people can see this. Other people, you just won't get it. Well, no, I actually think that people are more than capable of arriving at valid conclusions if they take the time to think about them carefully and reasonably. I think I will kind of close things there. I had plenty of other notes that I wrote, but at this point, I'm gonna just unmute people because I've got a few people that have questions in the chat. And Mark Cody has said he has a couple of thoughts that he would like to share. You can either post them in the chat, Mark, or you can unmute if you want. That's up to you. And so yeah, I am gonna give me 1 second, and I will figure out how to allow people to unmute themselves if they choose.